She was 22, and she had just watched her stepmother's lawyers slide a single sheet of paper across the table like it was garbage that needed to be thrown out quickly. No home. No savings. No family left who would return her calls. What she got instead was a ranger station. An old one, sitting empty on 60 acres of state forest land that hadn't seen a working fire lookout crew in almost 40 years. People laughed when they heard about it. To them it was worthless. A shack in the trees, not even worth the gas money to drive out and see it. But what none of them knew was that the ranger station was hiding something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this inspire you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Her name was Marianne Hale, and 6 months before she stood in that lawyer's office, she had still believed she had a family. Her father, Walter Hale, had died of a heart attack in March, sitting in his recliner with the television still on, a cup of coffee going cold on the side table. He was 61. He had always seemed, to Marianne, like a man built out of routine, up at 6, coffee at 6:15. The newspaper folded the same way every morning, even after most people had stopped getting newspapers at all. He was not a man who talked about his past. Marianne had grown up believing that was simply his nature, quiet and closed. A man who kept things to himself the way some men keep their coats buttoned even indoors. She would later understand that his silence had not been nature at all. It had been a decision, made and remade every day for over a decade, to keep a door closed that he was afraid to open. Marianne found out about his death 3 days after it happened, not from Denise, not from a phone call meant for her, but from a neighbor named Priya, who had noticed the ambulance and, out of a decency that ran deeper than blood in that house, tracked down Marianne's number through an old church directory. By the time Marianne arrived at the house she had grown up in, the house with the crooked mailbox post her father had never quite gotten around to fixing, the house with the maple tree in the backyard that she used to climb until her mother, and later her stepmother, told her she was too old for that kind of thing, Denise had already changed the locks. "This isn't your house anymore," Denise told her on the porch, arms crossed, not even bothering to open the screen door between them. Denise was 54, sharp-featured, the kind of woman who dressed for confrontations she hadn't been invited to yet. "Your father left everything to me. That's how it works when you remarry." "He wouldn't do that," Marianne said. Though even as she said it, doubt had already begun to work its way into her chest like a splinter. "He wouldn't leave me with nothing." "People change," Denise said. "People update their wills. You'd know that if you ever bothered to ask him about his affairs instead of assuming you were owed something just for existing." It wasn't entirely true. But Marianne didn't have $3,000 for a lawyer to prove otherwise, and Denise knew it. Marianne had exactly $412 in her checking account and a part-time job at a grocery store that didn't cover rent on its own, not since her roommate, Talia, had moved out the month before to live with a boyfriend in another state. Marianne had told herself she would find a new roommate quickly. She had not. The landlord had not been patient. By the time her father died, she had already been 2 weeks behind on rent, already fielding texts with exclamation points from a landlord who did not care that her world was falling apart. Only that the first of the month kept arriving on schedule regardless. She'd been staying in her car for 11 days by the time the letter arrived, a stiff cream envelope from a law office in a town called Larkspur. A town she had never heard of, and could not, at first, place on a map. The letter informed her, in the flat procedural language of legal correspondence, that a property had been left to her under the terms of a will predating her father's second marriage. A will he had apparently written years before he ever met Denise, and never updated, and never once mentioned, not at dinner, not during the drive to her college move-in day, not during any of the 1,000 small conversations a father and daughter share over 22 years. The property was a decommissioned forest ranger station in the mountains, unused by the Forest Service since 1987, deeded outright and without condition to Marianne Hale, and no one else. Denise found out about it before Marianne did. That was the part that stung the most, in the beginning, that even in this, Denise had somehow gotten there first, had somehow already known, had already made calls, had already, Marianne would later learn, tried to have the old will thrown out entirely before the estate attorney reminded her that a valid prior will predating the marriage, naming a biological child, was not something a probate court would simply set aside because it was inconvenient. Denise called Marianne exactly once about it, her voice syrupy with something that wasn't quite kindness and wasn't quite a threat either, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "You should let it go, sweetheart," she said. "Places like that get reclaimed by the state eventually. Nobody's kept the taxes current on it in years. It's not worth fighting for. It's not worth anything at all, truly. I'm only telling you this to spare you the drive." Marianne didn't understand, in that moment, why a woman who had already inherited a house, a retirement account, and 2 vehicles would care so deeply about a worthless shack 40 miles past the nearest gas station. She would spend the next 6 weeks finding out exactly why. In the days before she left, she went back once, uninvited, to the house on Larch Street to collect whatever remained of her childhood bedroom, only to find that Denise had already boxed most of it up for donation: yearbooks, a shoebox of concert ticket stubs, a soccer trophy from the 8th grade, all of it stacked by the curb like it had never mattered to anyone. Denise stood on the porch the entire time, arms crossed, watching Marianne load the boxes into her car without offering to help or even to speak, until Marianne was nearly finished, at which point Denise said only, "Your father kept things he shouldn't have kept. I hope you understand that whatever's waiting for you up there isn't a blessing, it's a burden, and I did try to warn you." Marianne hadn't understood the comment then. She would understand it fully soon enough, standing in a cold cellar 4 hours away with a stack of her grandmother's letters in her lap. She sold what little furniture she'd managed to keep in a storage unit, a bed frame, a bookshelf, a television that had been a hand-me-down from Talia, and used the money along with what remained in her checking account to fill her second-hand car with gas, a cooler of groceries, 3 gallons of water, and every blanket she owned. She did not know what she would find when she arrived. Some sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling of her car in a grocery store parking lot, she imagined the ranger station might already be collapsed. Roof caved in. Floor rotted through, nothing but a foundation and a chimney standing among the trees like a gravestone. Other nights she imagined it might be nothing at all, that Denise was right, that the state had already reclaimed it, that she would drive 4 hours into the mountains only to find a locked gate and a no trespassing sign nailed to a tree. And that would be the end of it, the end of her father's silence. The end of anything he had ever meant to leave her. The drive up into the mountains took just over 4 hours, the last 40 minutes of it on a gravel road that hadn't been graded in years, potholed and washboarded, her car bottoming out twice on ruts the size of bathtubs, the undercarriage scraping against a rock hard enough that she pulled over afterward with her heart pounding, certain she'd punctured something vital. She hadn't. The car limped on. The air changed as she climbed higher, thinner, colder, carrying a mineral sharpness that hadn't existed down in the valley, mixed with pine sap and wet stone and, faintly, wood smoke from somewhere she couldn't see. By the time she reached the turnoff marked only by a rusted metal sign reading Station 6, half swallowed by blackberry brambles, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows between the trees like the fingers of something reaching. There was a man waiting near the gate, though waiting might have been too strong a word. He looked, more than anything, like a man who happened to be standing there when she arrived. The way a fence post happens to be standing in a field. Older, perhaps 70, in a canvas jacket that had gone soft and colorless with age and use. A jacket that had clearly been through more winters than most people manage in a lifetime. He introduced himself as Hollis, said he'd looked after the place informally since the Forest Service pulled its funding and its people out decades ago, mowing back the brush twice a year so the building didn't disappear into the mountain entirely, the way so many other stations along that ridge already had. "Your father used to come up here," Hollis said, watching her get out of the car, watching the way her hands shook slightly as she pulled her jacket tighter against the cold. "Long before your time, I'd guess. Before the second marriage, certainly, before most things, really. He never mentioned it," Marianne said. "Not once. Not in 22 years. Hollis studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies weather he doesn't trust, weather that might turn on him if he looked away too soon. "Some things aren't lost," he said finally. "They're buried on purpose." He didn't explain what he meant by that. And when she asked, twice, gently, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt, he only shrugged. The kind of shrug that closes a conversation rather than opening one, and told her the well pump would need priming before she'd get any water out of the tap, and that she should watch the second porch step, because it was rotted clean through and would swallow a leg whole if she wasn't careful. He left her standing there with her headlights, cutting weak yellow cones through the deepening blue of dusk, and for a moment, just a moment, Marianne considered getting back in her car and driving straight back down the mountain. Back to the parking lots and the 11 nights, and the life that, however broken, at least had streetlights in it. She didn't. She turned instead toward the building. The ranger station itself was smaller than she'd pictured, smaller than the pictures the internet had shown her when she'd searched, weeks earlier, for anything at all about decommissioned fire lookouts, just to have some frame of reference for what she was inheriting. It was a squat wooden structure with a lookout tower rising off one side. 4 stories of narrow wooden legs supporting a small glassed room at the top, most of the panes clouded or cracked, one missing entirely and patched over with a warped sheet of plywood that had clearly been up there for years. The main building's windows were fogged with decades of dust and lichen, moss furring the north-facing shingles in a thick green pelt, and the whole structure leaned, almost imperceptibly, toward the east, as though it had spent 40 years slowly deciding to lie down. She stood in front of it for a long time before she went inside, feeling the cold coming up through the thin soles of her sneakers, listening to nothing at all. No traffic, no neighbors, no hum of appliances or distant television or car alarm going off 3 streets over. The small background noise of civilization she hadn't realized she'd spent her whole life swimming in until it was suddenly, completely absent. Just wind moving through pine needles somewhere far above her, and her own breathing, ragged in a way that embarrassed her even though there was no one left to hear it. The front door stuck when she pushed it, swollen in its frame the way old wood swells after enough winters of freeze and thaw, and she had to put her shoulder into it twice before it gave way with a groan that startled a bird. Something small and dark, out of the eaves above the doorway. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and mouse droppings, and the particular mineral coldness of a building that had never had insulation worth mentioning. A cold that seemed to come up out of the floorboards themselves rather than down from the ceiling. There was a wood stove in the main room, black with age, its flue disappearing up through a ceiling stained brown around the seam. There was a cot against the far wall with a bare, stained mattress that she resolved immediately not to touch with bare hands. There was a desk beneath the single clear window, its single drawer swollen shut in its frame so completely that when she finally worked it open, days later, with a butter knife and considerable patience, the wood along the edge splintered rather than sliding smoothly. She found a logbook first, in a cabinet that had somehow kept its door intact against the damp, its pages spanning 1974 to 1987, half filled with the kind of terse official notations lookout crews used to record. Wind speed, visibility, smoke sightings that turned out to be nothing. The occasional line about a supply drop being late. 3 different handwritings appeared across its pages. None of them her father's, as far as she could tell, though she had no real reference for what her father's handwriting had looked like as a young man. She sat with the logbook on her lap for nearly an hour that first night, reading entries about weather systems that had passed through decades before she was born, looking for some thread that connected any of it to Walter Hale, and finding nothing. No mention of his name. No hint of why this place, worthless, isolated, 40 miles from anything, had been the one thing he'd chosen, out of everything he owned, to protect from Denise with a decades-old will he'd never once spoken of. That first night, she slept in her car rather than trust the cot, parked close enough to the building that its dark shape blotted out a wedge of stars, and she woke twice to sounds she couldn't identify. Something moving through the brush near the shed. Something that might have been a deer, or might have been nothing at all. The kind of nothing that only exists in places quiet enough to invent it. She woke at dawn that first real morning, with frost furring the inside of her car windows, her breath having condensed and frozen overnight into a thin white lace across the glass. She sat for a while just watching the sun come up over the ridgeline, orange light sliding slowly down the lookout tower's weathered legs until it finally touched the ground where she sat. And for the first time in 11 nights, she felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was at the very least no longer despair. It was, she would think later, the first morning in a very long time that she had woken up somewhere that was unmistakably, legally, entirely hers, whatever state of ruin it happened to be in. The second day, she cleaned. It was easier, she found, to clean than to think, and there was a great deal of both to be done. She swept years of mouse droppings and dead insects from the corners of the main room, hauled the ruined mattress out to burn in a pit near the shed, scrubbed the desk with water heated on a camp stove because the well pump, true to Hollis's warning, produced nothing but a dry wheezing sound no matter how she worked the handle. She found, folded into the back of the logbook cabinet, a single photograph, black and white, curling at the edges, showing a woman in a canvas jacket not unlike the one Hollis wore, standing at the base of the lookout tower, with one hand shading her eyes against the sun. The woman was smiling in a way that seemed private, as though the photograph had caught her mid-thought rather than posing for it. There was no name written on the back. Marianne propped it against the window glass and looked at it every time she passed, unable to shake the feeling that something about the woman's jaw, the set of her shoulders, was familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. It was on her 4th night, hauling firewood in from the shed behind the station because the temperature had dropped hard with an early mountain frost, that she noticed the floor of the shed didn't sit right beneath her boots. A section of planking near the back wall that sounded hollow, where the rest of the floor sounded solid, a difference so small she might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been standing there in the dark, alone, with nothing to do but notice things. She knelt down on the cold dirt floor, moving aside a stack of split logs, and pulled back a rotted feed sack that had been covering the boards, releasing a smell of mildew and old grain that made her cough. Beneath the sack, a trapdoor, not large, perhaps 3 feet square, sealed shut, with a rusted iron hasp and a padlock so corroded with age and mountain damp that it looked almost fused to the metal loop around it. A single solid mass of rust rather than 2 separate pieces of hardware. She sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long moment, her breath fogging in the cold shed air, Hollis's words circling back to her uninvited. Some things aren't lost, They're buried on purpose. She went back to the car for a hammer first. The only real tool she had with her besides a small screwdriver kit meant for eyeglasses and phone batteries, entirely useless against a padlock that had clearly not been touched in decades. She struck the lock a dozen times, her arm aching, sweat beading despite the cold, and the padlock did not so much as shift. Nothing. She went looking through the shed itself next and found, wedged behind a coil of rotted rope and a stack of paint cans gone solid with age, an old crowbar, its handle wrapped in electrical tape that had gone brittle and cracked with time. She wedged the flat end under the hasp and threw her whole weight against it, feeling the metal bite into her palms even through her gloves, feeling the trapdoor groan and shudder beneath the pressure without giving an inch. Still nothing. She sat back again, breathing hard, her hands raw, and considered, seriously, for the first time, simply leaving it alone. She was exhausted. She was cold. She had spent 4 days scrubbing mouse droppings out of a building that might, in the end, hold nothing more meaningful than a few old logbooks and a photograph of a stranger. Denise's voice kept surfacing in her memory, patient and condescending. It's not worth anything at all, truly. But there was something in her. Something stubborn. Something that had survived 11 nights in a car and a stepmother's cold smile and a father's silence that had somehow followed her all the way up this mountain, that would not let her walk away from a locked door without at least trying, one more time, to open it. She found an old bolt cutter in the shed's back corner, half buried under a fallen shelf, its handle stiff with disuse, and streaked with the same rust that coated everything else in that shed, as though the whole structure had been slowly, deliberately corroding itself shut for 40 years. She dragged it back to the trapdoor, positioned the jaws around the shackle of the padlock, and squeezed with everything she had left. Nothing. She adjusted her grip, braced one foot against the shed wall for leverage, and squeezed again, harder, until her shoulders burned and her vision blurred slightly at the edges from the strain. Still nothing. She was ready to give up, truly ready, her arms trembling, a frustrated sound rising in her throat that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. When she shifted her weight one more time, adjusted the angle of the jaws by perhaps half an inch, and squeezed a third time. There was a crack like a bone breaking, sharp and sudden in the silent shed, and the padlock's shackle gave way all at once, sending her stumbling backward onto the dirt floor. For a long moment she simply sat there, breathing hard, staring at the broken lock in her hand, at the trapdoor now free of its hasp, at the dark seam where the door met its frame. Then she got to her feet, retrieved the flashlight from her jacket pocket, and knelt down to pull the door open. It was heavier than it looked, swollen with decades of mountain damp, and she had to brace both hands under the edge and use her whole body to lever it upward, the hinges shrieking in protest, releasing a gust of cold air from below that smelled like wet stone and something else beneath it, something mineral and faintly metallic, like the inside of an old well. Below the trapdoor, a narrow set of wooden stairs descended into darkness, disappearing after only a few steps into a blackness so complete her flashlight beam seemed to simply vanish into it rather than illuminate anything at all. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long moment, her heart hammering, the cold air from below rising up to meet the warmer air of the shed in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. Somewhere behind her, out in the dark trees beyond the shed, something moved through the underbrush, and she told herself it was a deer, the way she'd told herself the same thing every night since she'd arrived. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she started down the stairs, one hand braced against the rough dirt wall, her flashlight beam shaking slightly with each step. her breath coming out in small white clouds that dissolved into the darkness ahead of her. What waited at the bottom of those stairs would change everything she thought she knew about her father, about her grandmother, about the 60 worthless acres she had almost walked away from, and it would take everything she had left to face it. The stairs ended at a small root cellar, no more than 8 feet square, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone that sweated with dampness even in the beam of her flashlight. The air down there was colder than anything she'd felt yet, a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain frost above and everything to do with decades of complete stillness. Air that had simply never been disturbed since the day someone had last closed that trapdoor and walked away. Against the far wall sat a metal trunk, army green, the kind of surplus military trunk that might have been bought second-hand at any point across half a century. A name had once been stenciled across its lid in white paint, but time and damp had faded it to little more than a pale ghost of letters, unreadable no matter how she angled her flashlight against it. Beside the trunk, a wooden crate, its slats gone soft and gray. One corner caved in as though something heavy had once rested on top of it. She knelt in front of the trunk first, her knees cold against the packed dirt floor, and tried the latch. It didn't budge, fused shut with rust the same way the padlock upstairs had been, as though everything on this property had been built to resist exactly this moment, exactly this kind of curiosity. She didn't bother with tools this time. She dug her fingers under the edge of the latch and pried, feeling the rust bite into her skin, feeling small flakes of metal come away under her nails. She pried again, harder, angling her whole body over the trunk for leverage, and felt something give, not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to tell her the metal was weaker than it looked. Weakened by 40 years of damp mountain air working at it from every angle. She kept at it. Her fingers ached. Her fingertips split in 2 places, thin lines of blood mixing with the rust flaking away beneath her nails, and still she kept at it, some part of her mind distantly aware that she should probably stop, should probably go back upstairs and find better tools. Should probably not be doing this alone in a dark cellar 4 hours from the nearest hospital. She didn't stop. With a final wrench that sent pain shooting up through her wrist, the latch tore free entirely, and the trunk's lid groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved since before she was born. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to keep out the damp. Oilcloth that had clearly been reapplied more than once, layer over layer, by someone who had understood exactly what they were trying to protect, and for how long, were papers. Dozens of them, maybe more. Deeds, hand-drawn survey maps with elevation lines marked in faded pencil. A stack of letters bound with twine that had gone brittle and gray with age, so fragile that when she lifted the bundle, a few strands of the twine crumbled away entirely between her fingers. She sat back on the cold floor, the flashlight propped against the open trunk lid so it threw a wide cone of light across her lap, and untied what remained of the twine with hands that were shaking now for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The top letter was addressed, in handwriting she recognized instantly. The same slanted, careful script from the framed photograph propped upstairs against the window glass, to a woman named Ruth Hale. Her grandmother. A woman Marianne had never once heard her father speak of, not at a single birthday, not at a single holiday dinner, not in 22 years of a life that Marianne had believed, right up until this moment, to be entirely ordinary. Denise had always told her, whenever the subject of Walter's family had come up even glancingly, that his side of the family had died out before Marianne was born, said with the same flat finality she used to end most conversations she didn't want to have. The letters told a very different story. Marianne read for over an hour in that cold cellar, her fingers going numb, her back aching from hunching over the trunk, and slowly a picture assembled itself out of the fragments. A picture of a woman named Ruth Hale, who had, in the early 1960s, become one of the first women in the region to hold a permanent post as a fire lookout, working this very station for over a decade, watching the ridgeline for smoke through summers that stretched into autumns that stretched into winters she spent almost entirely alone, 4 hours from the nearest town by a road that had probably been worse then than it was now. Ruth's letters, some addressed to a sister back east, some apparently never sent at all, simply written and kept, the way some people write letters purely to organize their own thoughts, described a life of almost monastic solitude broken only by supply runs and the occasional visit from a Forest Service supervisor. But threaded through the loneliness was something else, a fierce, careful thrift. Ruth wrote, in one letter dated 1968, about setting aside a portion of her modest station wages every month, describing it almost apologetically, as though embarrassed by her own frugality. In another letter, dated 3 years later, she mentioned, almost in passing, buried in the middle of a paragraph about a hard winter, that she had used those savings, along with a small inheritance of her own from a great-aunt, to purchase something she called the mineral strip, a piece of land beneath the station property that a geological survey team had once flagged, during a routine study, as sitting atop an unusually pure vein of quartz. Marianne found the survey itself folded into the back of the last letter in the bundle, a stiff yellow document stamped with a state geological office seal, describing in dry technical language a deposit of high-grade quartz suitable for industrial glassmaking and electronics manufacturing. The kind of deposit, the document noted, that was of sufficient purity to warrant commercial interest, pending mineral rights clarification. Pinned to the survey with a rusted paperclip was a newspaper clipping, brittle enough that it nearly crumbled in her hands, showing a grainy photograph of a woman in a canvas jacket standing beside the same lookout tower Marianne had walked past every day for 4 days, without truly looking at it. The headline read, in type gone faint with age, "Local woman among first female fire lookouts in region." The photograph was the same woman from the framed picture upstairs, the same private, thoughtful smile. Marianne sat with that clipping for a long time, the cold of the cellar forgotten, understanding for the first time exactly why Denise had wanted her gone so quickly, so completely, so far from any lawyer who might have asked the right questions before the estate settled. Because Denise had known. The last letter in the bundle, not from Ruth this time, but from Walter himself, dated only 8 years earlier, apparently drafted and never sent, tucked into the trunk alongside his mother's papers, as though he hadn't been able to decide whether to keep it or destroy it, explained everything the rest of the letters had only hinted at. Walter wrote that he had found his mother's papers in an old filing cabinet shortly after marrying Denise, years after Ruth's death, and had told Denise about them in a moment of trust he had come to regret almost immediately. Denise, he wrote, had begun almost at once to press him toward selling the property, quietly, patiently, bringing it up at what seemed like random moments over months and then years, mentioning land brokers she'd supposedly heard about, mentioning how much simpler life would be without useless mountain land sitting there costing them property taxes every year. Walter wrote that he had refused, again and again, though he never fully explained to Denise why, and the letter suggested he barely understood it himself, some instinct, buried deep, that his mother's quiet decade of solitude and careful saving deserved better than to be sold off to the highest bidder by a woman who had never even seen the place. He had instead quietly consulted an attorney of his own, not the family attorney Denise trusted, but an old law school friend in Larkspur, and had rewritten his will to ensure the ranger station and everything beneath it would go, without condition, to his daughter alone, regardless of what happened to the rest of his estate. he had never told Marianne. The letter suggested, in its last few lines, that he had meant to, more than once, and had lost his nerve every time, telling himself there would be another year, another birthday, another quiet afternoon when the subject might come up naturally. There never had been. And then there had been no more time at all. Marianne folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and sat on the cold cellar floor until her legs went numb, the flashlight beam slowly dimming as its batteries weakened, and somewhere above her, through the shed's thin walls, she could hear wind picking up in the pines, carrying the first hint of a real mountain storm. The weeks that followed were slow ones, and she was grateful, in a way she hadn't expected, for how slow they were. She drove down to Larkspur twice in the first month, once to confirm with the attorney, a tired but kind older man named Mr. Okafor, that the mineral rights survey was genuine and still legally attached to the property, and once simply to buy tools she couldn't afford but bought anyway, telling herself she would find a way to pay it back later. She learned, with Hollis's patient and often silent guidance, how to prime the well pump properly, coaxing water up through pipes that hadn't run in decades, her hands blistering the first few times before they slowly toughened into something more useful. She learned to split firewood without losing a finger, a lesson that came with several near misses, and one afternoon spent nursing a bruised thumb while Hollis, watching from the porch, offered only the dry observation that the axe doesn't care how bad your week's been. A woman from the nearest town, a retired land surveyor named Connie, who had apparently worked alongside Ruth decades earlier and remembered her fondly, showed up one afternoon with a thermos of coffee and no real explanation beyond Hollis mentioned you might need company, and ended up staying to help Marianne clear brush from around the lookout tower's base for 3 hours before she'd accept so much as a cup of tea in return. Building something isn't about rushing, Connie told her that afternoon, wiping dirt from her hands onto a pair of worn canvas trousers that looked older than Marianne herself. You put one board down right, and then you put the next one down right, and you don't think too hard about the whole roof all at once. Because thinking about the whole roof all at once is how people give up before they've laid a single board. Your grandmother understood that better than almost anyone I ever knew. Small things arrived unasked, the way small things sometimes do in places where people still notice their neighbors. A bundle of cedar shingles appeared by the gate one morning with no note attached. Hollis brought over a generator he claimed he didn't need anymore, though Marianne suspected, from the careful way he'd maintained it, that this wasn't entirely true. A teenager from the valley, Connie's grandson, spent 2 Saturdays helping Marianne reglaze the lookout tower's broken windows in exchange for nothing more than gas money and, apparently, the novelty of climbing a genuine fire tower. There was a particular afternoon, midway through the second month, that Marianne would come to think of later as a kind of turning point, though nothing dramatic happened in it at all. She had climbed the lookout tower for the first time since arriving, working her way up the narrow wooden stairs one careful flight at a time, testing each step before committing her full weight to it, until she reached the small glassed room at the top where Ruth had once spent entire summers watching the ridgeline for smoke. The plywood patch over the missing pane let a cold draft through, but otherwise the room was intact. A narrow bench built into one wall, a brass alidade for sighting compass bearings still bolted to a waist-high table in the center. Its glass long since clouded, but its mechanism still turning smoothly when Marianne tested it with one finger. She stood there for a long time, turning slowly in place, taking in the view her grandmother must have taken in 10,000 times across those working years, ridge after ridge folding away into blue haze. No roads visible, no towns, nothing but forest in every direction until the horizon swallowed it. She understood, standing there, something she hadn't quite understood reading the letters in the cellar. That Ruth hadn't simply tolerated this solitude in order to save money for a quartz deposit. She had built a life out of it. A whole private world up here above the tree line, and the mineral rights had likely been, for her, less an investment than a kind of insurance policy. A quiet, careful way of making sure that whatever happened to her afterward, whoever came after her, would never be as powerless as she herself might have felt in other chapters of her life that the letters only hinted at and never fully explained. It was that afternoon that Marianne decided, without quite deciding it in words, that she would restore the lookout room properly rather than simply patch it and move on. It took the better part of 3 weeks, working in whatever daylight hours the shortening autumn allowed. She replaced the missing pane herself, guided over the phone by a glazier in Larkspur who talked her through the process step by step. Patient with her mistakes in a way no one in her life had been patient with her in a very long time. She refinished the built-in bench with linseed oil Connie brought over in an unlabeled glass jar, the wood slowly darkening and warming under her hands until it looked, for the first time in decades, like something someone might actually want to sit on and watch the horizon from. She found, tucked into a gap behind the Allidade's mounting bracket, one more piece of her grandmother's history, a small tin box, rusted at the seams but still sealed, containing a handful of coins from the 1960s and a single dried wildflower pressed flat between 2 pieces of waxed paper. So fragile it crumbled slightly the moment air touched it after decades sealed away. There was no note with it, nothing to explain what it had meant to Ruth, and Marianne found she didn't need one. Some things, she was beginning to understand, didn't require an explanation to matter. Slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice it happening in real time, the ranger station stopped looking abandoned and started looking lived in. Smoke rose steady and thin from the chimney most evenings now. The rotted porch step had been replaced with sound lumber, cut to size by Marianne's own hands under Hollis's watchful, mostly silent supervision. The windows, once fogged with decades of dust, let real afternoon light pour across the main room's floor for the first time in nearly 40 years, catching motes of dust that Marianne had, against all odds, come to find beautiful rather than depressing. She began corresponding with a mineral rights attorney recommended by Mr. Okafor, a careful, unhurried process that would take months to resolve fully, involving surveys and title searches and more paperwork than Marianne had known existed. She did not rush it, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not particularly want to. There was no urgency in her anymore the way there had been in those first 11 nights in her car. The land would still be there next month. The quartz vein would still be there next year. What mattered, increasingly, was the roof over her head, and the fire in the stove, and the slow, steady accumulation of small competencies that no one, not Denise, not anyone, could ever again take from her with a single sentence on a porch. Hollis came by less often as the weeks went on, though Marianne suspected it was less about needing to, and more about deciding, deliberately, to let her manage on her own. On the occasions he did stop by, he rarely stayed long. A few minutes on the porch, a comment about the coming weather. Sometimes nothing more than a nod, before he turned back toward the trail he walked most mornings. It was Connie who stayed the longest and talked the most, filling in details about Ruth that the letters hadn't covered. How she used to whistle old radio tunes across the ridge on clear afternoons. How she'd once gone 3 weeks without a supply drop during a bad stretch of weather, and never once complained about it to anyone who asked. She wasn't lonely up here, Connie said one afternoon, looking out toward the tower. People assume that, but she wasn't. She'd tell you there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and she was right about that. same as she was right about most things. By the start of the third month, Marianne had stopped counting the days since she'd arrived, which she took quietly, as its own kind of milestone. She had begun keeping her own logbook, picking up the habit from the cabinet full of old ones without entirely meaning to, jotting down weather and small repairs, and some nights nothing more than a single line about how the light had looked coming through the newly cleaned windows that afternoon. She wondered, writing those entries, whether Ruth had ever imagined someone else's hand-filling pages in that same cabinet decades later, and found she liked to think the answer was yes. Denise called once more, near the end of the second month, her voice carrying none of its earlier condescension, replaced instead by something tighter, more careful. She had heard, apparently through the small-town grapevine that seemed to stretch even into the valley she lived in, about the mineral rights. "We should talk about this like reasonable people," Denise said. "Your father would have wanted us to share. He didn't," Marianne said, and found to her own quiet surprise that her voice didn't shake at all. "He wrote it all down. I have his letter. I have Ruth's letters too. I know exactly what he wanted, Denise, and it wasn't this call." There was a long silence on the line, the kind of silence that told Marianne everything she needed to know about how much Denise had genuinely known, and for how long. Denise did not call again. It was late on a Tuesday evening, nearly 3 months after Marianne had first driven up that gravel road, the fire going low and warm in the stove, snow beginning to gather in a thin white line along the windowsill outside, when a letter arrived through the rural mail carrier, who came only twice a week now that the roads were worsening with the season. It was addressed to Marianne in handwriting she recognized without needing to be told. The same slanted, careful script from the trunk, from the framed photograph, from a woman she had never met but had come, somehow, to know intimately over these 3 months of letters and survey maps and long quiet evenings, piecing together a family history no one had ever offered her. It had been left with Mr. Okafor's office by her father years earlier, apparently, with instructions to forward it only once the estate had fully settled and the property had passed cleanly into her possession. Inside, Walter had written only a handful of lines, his handwriting less careful than his mother's, more hurried, the handwriting of a man who perhaps knew, on some level, that he was running out of time to say the things he'd spent a decade avoiding. He wrote that he was sorry he had never told her about the station, about her grandmother, about any of it. Sorry that Denise had made peace in their house feel impossible whenever the subject of his first family, his real family, had come up even glancingly, and that silence, over time, had come to feel like the easier road, the road that avoided the argument even as it built, year after year, into something far heavier than any single argument could have been. He wrote that the mineral rights were not the point, had never been the point, though he understood why they might seem like it now. The point, he wrote, was that some things worth keeping don't look like much from the outside. A cot, a wood stove, 60 acres of forest nobody wanted, and that he had trusted her. Even in his silence, even in his failure to ever quite find the courage to explain any of it while he still had the chance, to know the difference when the time finally came. Marianne read the letter twice by the low light of the fire, and then a third time, and then folded it carefully back into its envelope, and sat for a long while simply listening to the fire settle, to the wind picking up outside against windows that, for the first time in decades, actually kept the cold where it belonged. She thought, sitting there, about the woman in the black and white photograph, still propped against the window glass where she'd first set it, and about her father's cramped, hurried handwriting, and about the 11 nights she'd spent in a parking lot believing she had nothing left in the world worth claiming. She thought about how easily she might have let the whole property go, the way Denise had wanted, the way it would have been simpler to do, back when a ranger station 40 miles up a gravel road had sounded like nothing more than a cruel joke played on her by a man too tired or too afraid to explain himself while he still could. She understood now that it hadn't been a joke at all. It had been the only language her father had left for saying the thing he could never quite bring himself to say out loud, that some inheritances aren't measured in dollars, and that the ones worth the most are so often the ones that arrive looking like nothing at all. Your starting point doesn't define your ending. Sometimes what feels like the smallest inheritance, a shack in the trees, a locked trapdoor, a father's decade of silence, becomes the greatest gift of all, not because of what it's worth on paper, but because of everything it teaches you to build, board by board, with your own two hands, long after everyone else has already decided to stop believing in you. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and steady, settling over the roofline and the tower and the 60 acres that had once seemed, to almost everyone but two women, 50 years apart, like nothing worth keeping at all. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. What's something difficult you've built in your own life